Lucas Ellsworth had always preferred the solitude of his mansion. Its cold, marble floors and towering glass windows suited him well, each room a quiet, echoing testament to his success. The sprawling estate, isolated from the busy city below, was both his sanctuary and his prison. He rarely invited people inside, and even the staff, whom he saw only in passing, were nothing more than fleeting shadows in his world. Today had been no different. The morning had stretched into a tense afternoon of failed negotiations and sharp, cutting words. By the time he entered his home that evening, his mind was clouded with frustration, his shoulders tight from the weight of it all. He moved through the hallway, his footsteps muffled against the cool tiles, the familiar silence pressing in on him. His only desire now was to retreat into his study, pour himself a drink, and lose himself in the vast shelves of books that lined the walls. He passed the grand staircase, his gaze drifting absently to the large window that framed the setting sun, its soft amber glow spilling across the living room. It was then that he froze. The sight was unexpected, and it arrested his every thought. Sophie. She was standing by the window, her back to him, her body illuminated by the soft, golden light of the late afternoon. She was completely exposed. Naked, with only the gentle curve of her shoulders and the smooth line of her back visible to him. The way the sunlight wrapped around her form made the room feel suddenly alive, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. Her skin seemed to glow, almost ethereal in the light, and for a moment, Lucas forgot where he was, who he was. It wasn't just her body that held him in place, but the quietness with which she carried herself. Sophie was always composed, always gentle. But this was something different. In this rare, unguarded moment, she was entirely herself. He had never seen her like this. There were times, rare moments, when he caught her eyes across the room, her silent smile somehow managing to cut through the walls he had built around himself. But this was vulnerability, laid bare in a way that stripped the formality of their employer-employee relationship away, leaving something raw and real between them. Sophie didn't hear his approach, nor did she seem aware of his presence. She stood still, the soft curve of her neck exposed to the room, her long, dark hair cascading down her back in gentle waves. A sudden, quiet breeze moved through the open windows, sending a ripple through the curtains. For a fleeting moment, the entire world outside the mansion ceased to exist. All that mattered was this single, delicate image before him. He stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether to retreat or approach. Seconds stretched into minutes. His chest tightened, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He wasn't supposed to feel this way, not about Sophie. She was a part of the household, someone he'd known for years, someone whose presence had always been a quiet comfort. But now, she was something else entirely. Sophie shifted slightly, her gaze turning toward the window. Her eyes narrowed at the setting sun, and the way her body relaxed into the light made him feel like an intruder in the very space he owned. But he didn't leave. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath, his gaze tracing the lines of her silhouette. It was only then that she noticed him. Sophie's eyes flicked to his, her body stiffening for a brief moment as the reality of the situation hit her. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and laden with unspoken words. There was no apology, no frantic scrambling to cover herself. Sophie simply stood there, her expression calm but with a faint flush of pink creeping into her cheeks. I didn't expect anyone to be home so early," Sophie's voice broke the stillness, a soft, hesitant murmur. Her eyes dropped to the floor, but she didn't move to cover herself. Instead, there was something graceful in the way she accepted the moment, the vulnerability she had no choice but to embrace. Lucas cleared his throat, feeling the heat rise in his own chest. He should leave. He should turn around and walk away, retreat into the safety of his study where he could pretend nothing had happened. But for some reason, his feet remained rooted to the floor. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he finally said, his voice steady, betraying none of the sudden tension that coiled in his chest. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She simply met his gaze again, her eyes unwavering this time, her lips pressed into a soft, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of embarrassment or shame, but one of quiet acceptance. Sophie had always been composed, always so graceful in the way she carried herself. But in that moment, her vulnerability felt like a strength, an unspoken connection between them that neither could fully grasp. Lucas swallowed hard, his mind racing with thoughts that were both foreign and unsettling. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Sophie was his employee. She was a part of this house, nothing more, nothing less. And yet, as he stood there in the doorway, it became impossible to ignore the weight of the change between them. Something had shifted. Something had bloomed in the silence, and he wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it was real. I'll give you some space, Lucas muttered, his voice quieter now. He turned to leave, but before he could take another step, Sophie's voice stopped him. Lucas. His name was a soft breath between them. He paused, his hand still on the doorframe, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. Stay, she said, her voice steady now, a quiet invitation. There was no urgency in her words, only a gentle pull, like a silent promise. Just, stay for a moment. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Lucas didn't leave. He stood there, just beyond the threshold, as the space between them seemed to hum with something unspoken, something fragile. The air in the room felt thicker now, charged with a new energy, something neither of them could yet understand. Sophie didn't move any closer to him, and Lucas didn't approach her either. The distance between them felt like a vast expanse, both physical and emotional. Yet in that shared silence, there was an understanding, a recognition of the change that had just begun. And so, they remained, standing in the quiet room, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. Lucas stood there, unsure of how long he'd been frozen in place. His thoughts were a blur, swirling confusion, desire, and an unsettling sense of awareness he couldn't quite place. Sophie's quiet presence had always been a source of calm for him, but this was something entirely different. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the mansion seemed to grow distant, as if time itself had paused to let the room breathe. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that filled the space, keeping the tension palpable and thick. Lucas shifted his weight slightly, his eyes still on Sophie, who had yet to move, her expression soft, calm. The silence was almost too much. He had to fill it, even if the words didn't come easily. I wasn't expecting to see this, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of something unspoken. He didn't know if he was referring to her nudity or the unsettling way his heart raced when he looked at her. Sophie's gaze never faltered, but she nodded as if she understood. Neither was I, she replied, her tone quiet, but not apologetic. She was still standing, her bare body illuminated by the fading sunlight, but there was no shame in her posture. Just calm acceptance, as if her vulnerability were a part of who she was, unpretentious, untouched by the need to cover or explain. I didn't mean to intrude, Lucas said again, his voice faltering. His eyes flicked away for a brief moment, not sure whether to apologize or simply leave. The last thing he wanted was to make her uncomfortable, yet he was keenly aware of how the balance between them had shifted in a matter of seconds. You're not intruding, Sophie answered, a soft smile playing at her lips. You're not the first person to walk in on me, you know. Her words startled him. Not the first person. The thought that others, what others, exactly, had seen her this way unsettled him more than it should have. His eyes snapped back to her, though he immediately regretted it. Sophie was no longer just the maid, no longer just a figure who moved quietly through his home, taking care of the mundane tasks he rarely paid attention to. She was a woman. A real woman. And that realization hit him harder than it should have. I didn't think I would ever see you like this, Lucas said, his throat tight, unsure of what he even meant. The words sounded strange, foreign to him, but they were true. I don't know why I'm still standing here. He could feel the confusion and discomfort rolling in waves through his chest, as if every moment he stayed in the room, the lines of their relationship blurred even further. Sophie didn't shy away from his gaze. Instead, she took a step forward, closing the distance between them, though she didn't touch him. She stood a few feet away now, the air around them charged, as if the space between them had grown too small to ignore. There's no need to leave, Lucas, she said gently. Her eyes searched his, not with any particular urgency, but with quiet understanding. You don't have to pretend it didn't happen. We're both in this moment now. We can either let it pass like nothing has changed, or, we can let it mean something. The words hit him like a wave, crashing over him, knocking him off balance. What did she mean? Sophie wasn't just inviting him to stay. She was giving him a choice, one he wasn't ready to make, but a choice nonetheless. A choice that forced him to confront the unspoken feelings simmering beneath the surface, ones he had ignored for far too long. He opened his mouth to respond, but his words caught in his throat. What could he say to that? He had built his life on control, on maintaining distance from everything and everyone. He never let anything slip past the fortress he'd constructed around himself. But now, Sophie was standing in front of him, offering him a kind of vulnerability he didn't know how to handle, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. Sophie's smile faded into something softer, more knowing. She was no longer the maid he'd known for so long. She wasn't just an employee in his mansion. In this moment, she was someone different. Someone he couldn't quite categorize. She took another step closer to him, her voice quieter now, as though she were letting the weight of her words land. I know you've been distant, Lucas. I know you don't want to face what's right in front of you. But you don't have to run from it. The words hit him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. Sophie had always been perceptive, but now it was as if she saw him more clearly than he saw himself. She could read the hesitation in his eyes, the reluctance that was so deeply ingrained in him that he didn't even know where it began. I'm not running, he said, his voice more forceful than he intended. He took a step back, almost instinctively, but Sophie's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes were steady, almost searching him. Maybe not. But you've built walls around yourself, Lucas. And I can see them. The intensity in her gaze made him pause. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, every situation. But Sophie was forcing him to confront the one thing he had always avoided, his own vulnerability. For the first time, Lucas felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the physical presence of her nudity. It was her words, her insight into him, that had unraveled the armor he'd so carefully constructed. He exhaled slowly, realizing that the world outside the mansion had continued on without him. But here, in this room, time had stretched, and everything felt impossibly different. Nothing had ever felt this heavy, this urgent, or this real. Sophie didn't wait for him to respond. She simply turned away, walking toward the large bay window once again, as though the moment between them had reached its conclusion. The room felt strangely empty now, even though they were still standing just feet apart. Her back was to him once more, her silhouette delicate and ethereal in the fading light. I'll get dressed, Sophie said softly, breaking the silence. But it doesn't have to be like this forever, Lucas. We're both allowed to change. We're allowed to change together. Her words hung in the air as she turned toward the door, her calm, steady presence pulling Lucas out of his fog. He stood still for a moment longer, rooted in place, feeling the heaviness in the room settle like dust. Change. She was right. Things had already changed. In that moment, standing there in the quiet, with Sophie just a few feet away, Lucas realized that whatever walls he'd built for so long, whatever distance he'd kept between himself and others, had begun to crumble. The days following the unexpected encounter were marked by a strange quietness that settled over the mansion. Lucas Ellsworth couldn't quite explain it. This pull, this sense of being constantly aware of Sophie in a way that felt different, heavier. He had always been a man of routine, structured, controlled, and distant. His days were marked by meetings, strategy sessions, and financial reports. But now, even when he was buried in his work, he could feel the undercurrent of something more, something deeper. Sophie's presence, her silence, her grace, he couldn't shake her from his thoughts. She was still his maid, of course. But the space between them had shifted. A space he wasn't sure how to navigate. The morning after. Sophie was already in the kitchen when Lucas came downstairs. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, and she moved with quiet efficiency, preparing breakfast. She wore a simple, white blouse and dark slacks, her hair neatly pulled back into a bun. She looked composed, unaffected by the moment that had passed between them, and for that, Lucas felt a pang of discomfort. He had expected some awkwardness. Some distance. A change in the way she looked at him, or the way she interacted with him. But there was none of that. She was still Sophie. Professional. Polite. Respectful. "Good morning, Mr. Ellsworth," she said, glancing up briefly as she continued to arrange the plates. Lucas nodded, not trusting himself to speak at first. His throat felt tight, his mind still swirling with the memory of that golden moment. He had expected to feel awkward, maybe even embarrassed, but instead, it was as though a door had been opened, one that neither of them had the courage to walk through yet. "Morning, Sophie," he finally said, his voice hoarse. There was a pause as he took a seat at the breakfast table. Sophie continued with her tasks, moving around the kitchen, but Lucas couldn't focus on anything else but the way the sunlight spilled over her. The same sunlight that had illuminated her the other day, now softened by the early morning light. They shared breakfast in silence. The weight of the unspoken conversation hung between them, but neither of them brought it up. The minutes stretched, filled with nothing but the sound of silverware clinking against plates, the occasional murmur of the house settling around them. As the day wore on, Lucas found it increasingly difficult to focus on anything. His mind wandered back to Sophie, her quiet strength, the way she carried herself with such poise. He had always admired her professionalism, but now there was something more, something that made his heart race when he thought about her. By late afternoon, Lucas had found himself wandering the hallways of the mansion, aimlessly, unable to focus on the stacks of papers waiting for him in his study. The silence in the house was different now. It was quieter, more charged, as though it were waiting for something to happen. He found himself in the living room, standing by the same window where he had seen Sophie just days ago. The sunlight was different now, casting long shadows across the room as the evening approached. He could almost see her there, standing in front of the window, the way the light had caught her. He swallowed hard at the thought, shaking it away, but the image of her, the way she had looked so vulnerable, so beautifully exposed, would not leave him. Just then, he heard footsteps approaching. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. She didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, looking at him with that same quiet understanding. It was as though she could read the thoughts running through his mind, even though he had said nothing. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Lucas looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since their last encounter. Her eyes were steady, not avoiding his, but not challenging him either. She was still the same Sophie, the maid, the worker, the woman who had always been there. But something had changed. He could feel it now, more than ever. "No," he said, his voice low. "I just needed a moment." Sophie nodded and stepped aside, giving him space. But before she could turn to leave, Lucas found himself speaking again, his words spilling out before he could stop them. "You don't have to pretend like nothing happened," he said, the words catching in his throat. "I can't ignore what happened. What I saw." Sophie didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm, but he saw something in her eyes, something soft, something understanding. "I'm not pretending, Lucas," she said gently. "But there's nothing more to say. Not right now, anyway." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken tension. Sophie didn't leave, and Lucas didn't move. They stood there in the quiet, not sure how to bridge the distance that had opened between them. The walls that Lucas had spent years building around himself were beginning to crumble, but he wasn't ready to face it, not yet. But Sophie? She wasn't afraid of what lay beyond the walls. Later that evening, Lucas found himself on the terrace, staring out at the city below. The mansion's view stretched for miles, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance. But no matter how far his gaze reached, he couldn't shake the image of Sophie. She lingered in his thoughts, not just as the maid, but as someone who had the power to change everything. He didn't know what to do with that. Sophie's presence had always been a quiet comfort. But now, it was more than that. It was a pull, an invitation to something deeper, something he had been avoiding for so long. For the first time in years, Lucas felt something he couldn't control. And as he looked out at the city, he realized that for all the power and wealth he had amassed, it was this raw, uncharted territory of emotions, that was beyond his grasp. Days bled into weeks, and Lucas found himself caught in the growing web of his emotions, his thoughts often drifting back to Sophie. He couldn't ignore the quiet pull she had on him. It was subtle at first, just a glance here, a brief moment there, but now it felt impossible to escape. No matter how hard he tried to focus on his business, there was an underlying restlessness that gnawed at him. It wasn't just the way she moved through the house with quiet grace, or the soft timbre of her voice that haunted him. It was the way she made him feel, like a man who had long been running from his own emotions, and now, for the first time in years, was being forced to confront them. Lucas was used to control. His life was a delicate balance of power, calculation, and distance. Emotions had no place in his world. But Sophie was different. Her calm demeanor and quiet strength made him feel things he wasn't ready to feel. He caught himself watching her more than he should, wondering if she felt the same way, or if he was simply projecting his own desires onto her. The silence between them grew more intense with each passing day. The casual glances at breakfast, the occasional conversation that felt strangely strained, everything felt like it was building to something neither of them dared to acknowledge. The unspoken confession. One evening, as the mansion's vast halls grew quieter with the setting sun, Lucas found himself in the study, staring at the papers spread before him. But his mind wasn't on the figures or reports in front of him. It was on Sophie. He had never been a man who struggled with clarity. He knew what he wanted, and he went after it with precision. But Sophie had somehow bypassed his walls, entered his thoughts, and now he wasn't sure how to remove her. He heard footsteps approaching, soft yet deliberate. He didn't need to look up to know it was Sophie. The air shifted when she entered the room, bringing with her the familiar calmness that had always settled over him. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said quietly, as she entered, "I didn't mean to disturb you." Her voice was steady, but there was a hesitation in it that made Lucas pause. He turned to face her, his heart inexplicably racing. Sophie wasn't looking at him, but her gaze flickered to the papers in front of him. "You're not disturbing me," he said, his voice low, trying to sound casual. But it wasn't casual. Nothing felt casual anymore. There was a beat of silence, and then Sophie stepped forward, just slightly, enough to close the distance between them. "I'm just checking on you. Is everything all right?" Lucas stared at her, surprised by the softness in her voice, the concern that he hadn't expected. He had always kept people at a distance, but Sophie's kindness, her ability to see through him, was both unsettling and soothing at the same time. "I'm fine," he said quickly, though it didn't sound convincing, even to himself. He wanted to reach for the control he so desperately clung to, but it was slipping through his fingers. The room felt suddenly too small. The space between them, once so easily navigable, was now charged with something more. Sophie seemed to sense it too. She hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Ellsworth. Lucas, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The simplicity of her words, the honesty behind them, hit Lucas in a way he hadn't anticipated. For a moment, he considered telling her everything, the weight of his thoughts, the struggles he'd hidden for so long. But he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he stood up, unable to keep the distance any longer. "Sophie," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at him, her gaze steady. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. But still, the moment hung between them, heavy with what they both knew but neither was ready to say. Before Lucas could finish his sentence, Sophie gave him a small, reassuring smile. "It's all right," she said softly. "I understand." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them thick enough to touch. It was a strange, bittersweet feeling, a mixture of longing and rest. Restraint, of wanting to reach out but not knowing how. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "I'll leave you to your work." Lucas watched her retreat, the weight of the moment settling over him. He knew, deep down, that this, whatever was happening between them, was only the beginning. But what it would lead to, he couldn't yet say. As Sophie closed the door behind her, Lucas exhaled slowly, his thoughts a tangled mess of emotions and questions. He didn't know what was happening, but he couldn't deny it any longer. The walls he'd built so carefully were crumbling, piece by piece, with Sophie at the heart of it. Later that night, as the mansion grew still and quiet, Lucas found himself on the terrace, looking out over the city. The lights twinkled below, but the vastness of the view only made him feel more isolated. His mind kept returning to Sophie, the way she had looked at him, her soft smile, her unwavering understanding. She had become something more than just a maid, more than just an employee. She was everything. And yet, he still didn't know what to do about it. As the night stretched on, Lucas realized something. He wasn't just running from his emotions. He was running from the possibility of something real. Something he hadn't allowed himself to believe in for years. But in the quiet of the night, with the weight of his thoughts pressing on him, Lucas realized he couldn't run forever. The days seemed to blur together, each one feeling like a slow crescendo that built towards something neither Lucas nor Sophie could predict. The mansion, once a fortress of solitude and control for Lucas, now felt more like a place of constant inner conflict. He could no longer escape the pull Sophie had on him. Every glance, every word, every moment spent near her felt loaded with unspoken meaning. The walls he had built around his emotions were weakening, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. One afternoon, Lucas sat at his desk in the study, the quiet hum of the mansion surrounding him. He had been reviewing financial reports for hours, but his mind kept drifting. He couldn't focus. Sophie had been in and out of the room, doing her usual duties, but something about today felt different. Her presence lingered in the air, heavier than usual, and he found himself stealing glances at her whenever she passed by. As she came to deliver a stack of papers, their hands brushed briefly as she handed them to him. It was a simple gesture, an accidental touch, but it sent a shock of heat through his body. He quickly pulled his hand back, trying to disguise the surge of emotion that coursed through him. He looked up, only to find Sophie's eyes on him. There was no awkwardness, no hint of discomfort. Just a soft, knowing look that sent a jolt through him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Lucas cleared his throat, trying to steady his racing heart. "It's fine," he said, though the words didn't come as easily as they should have. There was a moment of silence, thick with unspoken words, before Sophie turned and left the room. He sat there for a long while, the room suddenly too small, too suffocating. It was just a brush of the hand, but it felt like the start of something neither of them could ignore anymore. An unexpected confession. That evening, as the mansion grew quieter and the sun set behind the horizon, Lucas found himself wandering the hallways, restless and lost in his own thoughts. He hadn't meant to seek out Sophie, but somehow, his feet had carried him to the kitchen, where she was preparing dinner. She was standing at the counter, chopping vegetables, her movements fluid and practiced. The soft light from the overhead fixtures bathed her in warmth, making the room feel more intimate than it had ever been. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before clearing his throat. "Sophie," he said, his voice low. "Can we talk?" Sophie didn't turn around immediately, but after a few moments, she glanced over her shoulder, her expression calm but curious. "Of course, Mr. Ellsworth. What's on your mind?" There was a small hesitation before Lucas stepped further into the room, the distance between them now charged with an electric tension. He didn't know why he was suddenly so nervous. He had spoken with her 1,000 times, but tonight felt different. The weight of the unsaid words between them pressed heavily on him. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know what's happening between us, Sophie. But I can't ignore it anymore. You've been, on my mind. More than I care to admit." Sophie didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there, her hands still, and her gaze steady. Her silence was enough to make Lucas wonder if he had said too much. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie slowly turned to face him fully. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice full of warmth but also something deeper, something unspoken. "You're not the only one who feels it." The words hit Lucas like a wave, crashing over him with an intensity he hadn't expected. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought he might be imagining it. But there was no mistaking the sincerity in her voice, the quiet strength in her eyes. "You've always been more than just an employee to me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been afraid to admit it. Afraid of what it means." Sophie took a small step toward him, her gaze never leaving his. "I understand," she said gently. "But sometimes, the things we fear the most are the things we need to embrace." The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Sophie's presence, her quiet strength, seemed to fill the room in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. For the first time, Lucas felt the weight of the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. He didn't know what to say next. What could he say? The fear of crossing the line between employer and employee had kept him at arm's length for so long, but now that line felt so blurred, so insignificant in the face of what they were both feeling. Sophie took another small step forward, her eyes soft, but filled with determination. "You don't have to be afraid, Lucas," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "We're both adults. We know what we're feeling. The only question is what we do with it." Lucas didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. Sophie was right. There was no denying what had been building between them for weeks. It was real. It was undeniable. And as he looked at her, standing so close now, her eyes searching his, Lucas realized that he didn't want to run anymore. He didn't want to hold back. Without thinking, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas allowed himself to feel. To be vulnerable, to be human. He reached out, his hand brushing hers once more, but this time, it wasn't an accident. The moment hung in the air, charged with 1,000 emotions. And then, without a word, they both stepped forward into the unknown, together. The days following their quiet exchange in the kitchen were heavier than Lucas anticipated. Every time he crossed paths with Sophie, it felt like the weight of their unspoken words pressed on him. There was no going back now. The boundaries between them, once so clearly defined, had blurred, and neither of them could deny the pull that had been building for weeks. The mansion felt different now. Even though everything appeared as it always had, the atmosphere was charged, simmering with an energy that neither could fully understand yet. Sophie continued with her duties, as professional as ever, but Lucas noticed the small, subtle changes in the way she carried herself, more confident, more aware of the space between them. He tried to keep his distance, to maintain the carefully constructed barrier that had defined their relationship. But the more he tried, the harder it became. Her presence seemed to infiltrate every corner of his thoughts. It wasn't just her physical beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the way she moved through the world, quietly, with grace, and yet with an undeniable strength. It was her voice, her calm demeanor, her ability to see through the walls he had so carefully built. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and calls, Lucas returned home later than usual. The house was quiet, the lights dimmed for the night. He walked through the hallway, heading toward the kitchen for a drink, when he heard the soft sound of laughter. It was coming from the kitchen. Sophie stood near the counter, her back to him, speaking to someone on the phone. Her voice was light and cheerful, a contrast to the reserved woman he had come to know so.